Hi, my name is Sarah Schechner, and I am a Massachusetts quilter and have a background in museum work and history of science. I want to tell you about this quilt show, which is in commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And for this show, we wanted to feature mainly a women's activity, which is quilting, though there can be men quilters for sure, and also to introduce the public to the wide variety of quilts that are possible to be made. That quilts are not just all about beds. There are art quilts like you see next to me here, and quilts of different techniques and styles. And many quilts can have a message as well, and not just be abstract pictures of just total color shapes or pictures of landscapes and houses or star blocks, but they can take many creative forms. And so this show is divided into several areas of antique quilts, traditional quilts that are inspired by antique styles or methods, but using modern fabrics and color schemes. Then we have contemporary quilts that are very modern, abstract, or pictorial, like this one next to me. And then we have quilts that are been showcased with flowers that are depicting them juxtaposed, but inspirational flower arrangements with the quilts. We're calling that quilts in bloom. And there are two other thematic areas. One are quilts of protest, which are quilts that are making a statement, often political, about equal rights, climate change, and so forth. And in this area that we're standing is an area we're calling the Spirit of 1775. And this was a place for the quilters to contribute quilts that spoke to that idea, whatever the spirit of that revolutionary period was for them. It may be red, white, and blue colors. It may be, as in the case of the quilt next to me, an image of the goddess Liberty. This is one of my quilts, and here I'm showing the goddess Liberty holding a flag in one hand, and in her left hand here she's holding one of the lanterns that Paul Revere saw in the Old North Church on the night that he started his famous ride. There were two lanterns that he witnessed. One survives and is in the Concord Museum. And we were very delighted to be able to partner with the museum for this quilt show in offering our quilters the opportunity to select an object in their collection as inspiration for a quilt. So I selected Paul Revere's lantern, and here it is with rays coming out, and I put it in the hands of Liberty. And Liberty here is based on some paintings of Liberty done around 1800, 1810. That's why she's kind of in this Jane Austen style of dress. And I decided she could be very feminine, as was in this paintings, and show her female fortitude, if you will, but the gentleness of being like Flora with flowers and her curly hair. So I decided not to make her like dowdy draping of, often Liberty looks kind of dour. She's very feminine. And this is a flag, based on an early flag of the American Republic. So it has an unusual number of stars, each one for the states that were in the Republic at that time. And there are little things, quilted into it. The one thing I used a cutout of here for the candle flame. It's an image of a firefly that was from some fabric I had, and they were flying all over the fabric, and I took a little firefly and turned it upside down, and that's the flame. So there are little There are little things in there that are hidden for people to find, but this spoke to me for the spirit of 1775.
Welcome to everyone. Welcome to the Concord Academy Performing Arts Center. We're thrilled to be here with Gerald Roy and Jennifer Swope for an exciting presentation. This is part of the Quilts 250th Stitching in the Spirit of Democracy program. This is our keynote lecture. I'm Holly Kratzley. I'm a member of the Concord 250 Executive Committee, which has been planning activities around the 250th anniversary of the battle at the North Bridge in Concord. For 2.5 years, my subcommittee on community participation has been working with 3 regional quilt guilds to produce this large 2-day quilt show, keynoted by the wonderful lecture that you're about to hear. I want to take this opportunity to thank the town of Concord and all of the other members of the Concord 250 Executive Committee for supporting this event, and to express my sincere gratitude to the Concord Peacemakers, Quilters Connection, and Rising Star for their countless hours of planning and implementing this event. I am not a quilter, and I had no idea how complicated these shows were, and now I know, but I didn't have to do all of the coordination work, and I am so grateful to those 3 guilds that have stepped up and done an amazing job. It's been a wonderful collaboration, and that accounts for us all being here today, that they were able to pull it off and do it so well. Yes. There are so many individuals to thank, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I really do want to express my gratitude to Gail Coit of Concord Peacemakers. Yay. Gail has been the glue that's held us together and organized all the Zoom calls and dotted all the I's and crossed the T's. Sarah Schechner and Sherry Winkleman from Quilters Connection have... and Dorothy Kennedy of Rising Star all offered their leadership and organizational skills. So Dorothy. Dorothy organized all the volunteers, and there are many. From the beginning, we wanted to make this exhibit an educational experience, and we knew that we needed to have a significant keynote address. There was unanimous agreement that we would like to have Gerald Roy as our speaker, and fortunately, as you know, he said yes. And we were delighted to learn that Jennifer Swope would present with him. Gerald Roy is one, if not the major American quilt collector. Part of his collection was featured in a special exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston 11 years ago. And the museum book, Quilts in Color, the Pilgrim Roy Collection, is a valued possession of many in the audience today, I know. Gerald has been collecting quilts since the late 1960s and has become a quilter himself. His expertise is highly valued in consulting on all things quilt, including appraising quilts, lecturing on them, writing about them, including, I think, 7 books to date. So we are thrilled to have him share his knowledge with us today. Jennifer Swope has been at the MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts, since 2002, and is the David and Roberta Logie Curator of Textiles. And she has worked with Gerald on, she worked initially with him on the Pilgrim Roy Collection exhibit and has worked with him since then on other projects. Her academic background is in American decorative arts, of which quilts are a significant part. So the fact that our focus today is on American quilts is very, well, American quilts with a European ancestry. In 2021, Jennifer organized the exhibit at the MFA entitled Fabric of a Nation. So textile arts are dear to her heart. We are most fortunate to have them sharing quilts with us today in person, and their presentation is entitled American Quilts, the Art and Story of a Nation. So enjoy. Thank you.
This is not Moravian, by the way.
Okay.
just changed my mind.
Packing up and going?
Yeah, no, we're not leaving. It's okay.
Okay. This is Jen, and this is Jerry. And I'm a Pilgrim Roy, and she's a Boston Museum person. Jen and I have been working together for 20 years. Yeah, it is 20 years.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah. She started only this high. In fact, her two children were children when we first met. I ended up at the Boston Museum as sort of an accident. The former head of our department, which is the textile and fashion arts and now jewelry, right?
Yes, and jewelry.
She and I met, and we were actually at an auction together, and I was looking at something, and she was looking at something for the museum, and I was looking for something for a client, because I also help other people put collections together. And she said, well, I guess if you're here, there's no point in me thinking about this quilt. And I said, no, it's exactly the opposite. I'm not interested in it, and neither are you. And she said, oh, can you tell me why? I said, yes, but not here. Because Stephen Fletcher, who is the president of Skinner's Galleries, was a very good friend of mine. And so anyway, Pam Parmel and I met. We became very good friends. And she asked me if I would come and look at the Boston Museum quilt collection. Because before she left the museum, and because of her love and her interest in all textiles, as well as quilts, she wanted to improve the textile collection of the Boston Museum by including quilts. And there were quilts in the collection at one time. I mean, there were quilts in the collection always, but not of the seriousness that she and I went into. And eventually, there were actually 4 of us who formed a crew that put together that first exhibition, Quilts in Color. And Jen had just come in to the department, and not too many people in the department had a tremendous amount of knowledge of quilts to begin with, or at that time. But we all really learned together. And I at one point said, you don't really have a quilt collection. You have a collection of quilts. And you have a collection of quilts that mostly represent really, really fine examples of needlework. And they represent probably the ladies, years of ladies in Boston who had the time and the energy to put out these beautiful pieces of needlework, but they weren't necessarily quilts. And they weren't even really things that you would ever put on a bed, because the quality of the work was so amazing. And I'm going to ask Jen to talk to you a little bit about how, between she and I and this last 20 years, how the museum collection has changed. First of all, I want to ask how many, I can't see everybody in here, but is everybody in here familiar with quilts and knows about quilt history and doesn't have to be told how quilts were made in 1790? Of course, there's not a lot of quilts left from 1790 anyway, but I often, when I start talking to people, I'll say, tell me what a quilt is. Tell me what you think is a quilt. And you'd be surprised the answers I get. My advice to people with regards to knowing what a quilt is and what a quilt isn't is that a quilt is not a quilt unless it's quilted. Now, doesn't that make sense? Well, I'm also a quilt appraiser, and you would be surprised what is brought to me that I'm told is a quilt. And I will often say, I'm a quilt appraiser, and that's not a quilt. Well, what do you mean? That's what my family has always called it. I said, it at best is a tied comforter. And the top of it probably is intended to be a quilt at one point, but it isn't now, it never will be, because it isn't quilted. People confuse patchwork with quilting as well. Patchwork and quilting are two very different things. And in Europe, they always separated the two. There were always patchworkers and there were always quilt makers. Patchworkers did the top and quilt makers quilted. Now, of course, in this country, we've gotten sort of back to that now too, because of all of the because of all the machine quilts that are out there. So now a lot of patchworkers are back patching their quilts and then handing them off to someone to do the quilting. But before I get into this presentation, now, this is the first time these things have been shown publicly. It's a collection that my partner and I started putting together probably 50 years ago. And they're quilts made by a group of Moravian women at a certain period of time when the Pennsylvania was full of Moravian people. But I'm going to let Jen tell you a little bit about what we've achieved at the Boston Museum since we've been running it.
It's very good. Well, thank you, Jerry. And I would like to acknowledge.
Is her mic on?
Yeah. I would just like to thank you, Jerry, for teaching me pretty much everything that I know about quilts. Because like the many layers that have to come together for someone to make a quilt, understanding their history and their meaning through time all the way to today. I was thrilled to see the quilt show just in the gymnasium a few steps away that would span 1844 to a quilt made by a 9-year-old, that it is truly a living tradition. And I didn't really understand that until I met you, and then the whole circle, the wide circle, international circle of people that, you know.
She's like a sponge. You tell her something and all of a sudden it sinks in and it's spit out to you 20 minutes later or 3 days later. But it has been such an encouraging phenomenon for me to have this young woman to work with, because she's not only smart, but she came with a tremendous amount of knowledge to begin with, and then you pile that off with what we've piled on her, and you really got something.
Well, and the layers, again, back to the layer. Thank you, Jerry. That's very nice of you. But it is helpful to learn not only from a very knowledgeable person, but also, as you all know, from the very best examples. So like right here in Concord Academy, if someone takes an English class, they start with the best American literature. Well, I got to start with the best American quilts and looking at your collection that you put together with Paul Pilgrim. Because learning about these, and they really are exceptional quilts. And I have to remind myself of that sometimes, that if you imagine a triangle, your quilt collection, and now many of which are in the MFA and other museum collections, they're really not necessarily that representative of quilts that people lived with, because they were very, very special, whether they were Moravians making pieced quilts in challenging colors of orange, which we'll get into, or Baltimore album quilts made and carefully embroidered. They were still all very, very special. So if you see a quilt in a museum, chances are it's really never been washed. It's just been put on a bed for a moment, probably never even been slept under, and carefully folded away. So I look at a lot of these quilts and I think of not only the makers from 100, 200, 300 years ago, all the people after who had the sense not to put it in the washing machine, not to use it as a picnic blanket, not to use it as a dog bed. There's just, that there is this love of these works of art through time. And I think you can see it just like today that I saw it in the quilt show, like you see it in every stitch.
Well, there was so much to learn about quilts to begin with. When Paul and I first started collecting,
You should introduce Paul Pilgrim.
Paul Pilgrim is where Pilgrim Roy comes from. And Paul and I met in undergraduate school, went through graduate school together. So between the two of us, like my father said, either one of you could have been a doctor if you hadn't gone to art school. We had about 40 years together with regards to just our interest in art. We knew what art was according to us. And when we discovered quilts, we didn't want anything anything to do with those who, in our minds, were works of art. And one of the biggest things that came upon us as we started collecting was condition, condition, condition. People look at these and say they've never been used. Not all quilts were made to be used. And as a result of that, there are those quilts that are extremely special, not only to the people who made them, but the people who owned them, and they kept them. And that's what we collected. Both of us felt the more you had to excuse, the more you had to excuse in terms of condition, the less the quilt is worth. When we started collecting, we fooled ourselves by saying it was investments. Well, 1,500 quilts later, and the pile to sell and the pile to keep is this big, and my father saying, it's only an investment when you sell something. So, but again, the Boston Museum has helped me there as well, because I found a place for my best stuff. And Jennifer has helped me a long way as well as that. All right, we should start looking at quilts, I guess.
Yes, that's what people came for.
When we discovered Moravian quilts, it was not unusual for us because we looked at the Amish quilts and the Mennonite quilts as quilts that took our interest more than what we call the mainstream quilts. The pretty Pennsylvania Dutch, the appliques, the floral patterns, the printed patchwork. We like solid colors. And most of the collection is representative of just solid colors rather than prints. But also we realized that within the religious orders, there were quilts that interested us more than the others because the coloration was more to our liking. And as you see here, a lot of these quilts fell out of favor many, many years ago, probably not too far after they were even made, because they didn't fit people's decorating schemes. They weren't sought after by decorators. I can remember being at sales in Ephrata and in any of the small towns in Pennsylvania, and the quilts of this type, as well as the Amish and the Mennonite quilts, the solid colored quilts, were not selling. And the first Moravian quilt that we bought, we were sitting in an auction with some of the top dealers throughout the country, throughout New York. And we thought, we're never going to be able to afford that, because we assumed that was what they were there for. Well, it's right over there. And we paid hardly anything for it. And there was an elderly woman sitting next to me at the auction. And after we bought it, I said, excuse me, I assumed you and all these people were here for this quilt. She says, oh my God, no. She said, who wants that ugly thing?
Should we get it out?
You know,
Should we get
would
it
you
out?
hang that on your wall? Would you put it on your bed? Of course not. It's ugly. Well, we put together the biggest, ugliest bunch of quilts you've ever seen. And suddenly in the 1990s, they suddenly became much more valuable than they had ever been before. Okay, let's look at...
Perfect.
Now, the Moravian quilts, there was about a period of 50 years when the Moravian culture... Now, the Moravian culture were people that came to this country from Europe, and they were originally from a country that was it's the Czech Republic now. But their primary interest in coming to this country was to teach both the American Indians, the Native Americans, as well as the enslaved people, Christianity. And they believed that they truly believed that there was no person on earth that was any better or any worse than anybody else. They believed in total equality. They were the first group that we can call what is so popular today, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That was the Moravians.
Yeah. You should talk about the quilt they're holding up because they're going to get tired holding it.
Okay, this is the first quilt that we were able to buy. Unfortunately, orange has really a bad rap, and I don't quite understand what is the problem with the color orange, because it's the complement of blue, and most people say their favorite color is blue. Well, the complement of blue is orange, so when you use the two together, you're using them together at their highest degree of workmanship.
Okay, their arms are tired.
And of course, there are lots and lots of shades.
Their arms are tired, so they're going to put that away
Yeah,
because
yeah,
their
yeah,
arms
yeah.
are tired. Okay.
But you see, they're solid colors, and not only are they solid colors, they're equal in intensity. Put that down for a minute, because your arms are going to get tired. Because I'm going to talk about it first. Do you all understand what equal intensity means? Okay, it's the light refractive quality a color has. And when you put two of them together that have equal light intensity, then you get a greater play or interplay of color between them. It's where all the Joseph Albers theories started, with his interaction of color theories in the 1940s. Well, the quilt show that we did first, which is Quilts in Color, was something I always wanted to do, to show the quilters 100 years before Joseph Albers were doing interaction of color. So these quilts basically all rely on that strength of color in order for them to react together. And they react together by constant motion. For instance, when you look at one color, it appears to be in front of the other. Then the minute you change your gaze into another, then it fluctuates. That's what interaction of color actually means. It means the colors have the ability to fluctuate. Now that doesn't happen with contrast. And that's why you'll hardly ever see a quilt with white in it in our collection.
Beautiful. And this is a Joseph's coat?
Let me see okay.
That's a Joseph's coat? Right.
Yeah, let me see the front of this, please. Okay, this is an Irish chain. You're going to find a lot of traditional patterns that are used by the Moravian culture, but you're not going to find the colors that you're going to find in a lot of the traditional colors. Because of eliminating white, of course, it does change them considerably from the traditional. All right, you want to see something? I'll move over.
I'm sorry? These are 1880s?
I'm sorry, yes.
1880s?
They all are within a 20-year period of 1880. And the reason I know that is because all of the fabrics, the greens are all the same throughout all of the quilts, and more than one person did it. So obviously the interest was to keep those particular colors together. You tell the age of a quilt not only by the fabrics that are in it because of how they were produced, but the colors because things changed according to fashion. And also many times because of the solid colors, you have to look on the back of the quilt to see a printed fabric that will give you also an idea of when the quilt was made. And they will use prints on the back because they're not going to go through the expense of putting a solid piece across the whole back of the piece. But
and there's also a lag. So the chromium, that yellow, that orange, like chromium or cheddar, the chemists figured that out in the 1820s, but it takes a while for these fabrics to get to essentially a middle class market. And so these
fabrics change a good every 20, 30, 40 years at the most, because the fabric manufacturers want women to keep on buying cloth. So they don't produce the same designs over and over again. And those designs also have a great deal to do with the fashions of the period as well. But cloth moves quickly, not as quickly as it does today. But you have to remember that these fabrics were purchased, which is unusual for a quilt making of this period. Whereas prior to purchasing, you used what was left over in the household from other things. There were scraps.
Jerry, do you want to talk about the baskets before it gets put away? Because that was such a popular pattern.
Pardon me?
Do you want to talk about the basket pattern before it gets put away? The baskets? Because there was a popular pattern.
Well, the set of the baskets, of course, have been pieced for centuries. But this particular quilt is interesting the way the baskets are set so that it creates a center medallion. Usually they're just fluctuating continuously straight this way, straight this way. And then, of course, the zigzag border adds to it all. When you actually get into the design aspect of them, then you really get looking at the sets. So because you want the sets to be as interesting as the techniques themselves. Now, the techniques of sewing are one thing. The techniques of quilting are another. When we first started buying Amish quilts, we would go into these small Amish farmhouses and we would ask to take the quilts outside so that we could stand at least 20 feet away from them.
Where you are right now.
Because we were looking at the artistic aspect of the pattern, how it was set and whatever. And most dealers were only looking at the fine points of quilting or if all the points and everything matched. That wasn't necessarily that important. This is an extraordinary quilt. All right, this is tree of elastic, and it's a very, very old pattern. I have seen this pattern done in the mid-1700s, and done of chintzes and done of all other fabrics. It's a wonderful design, and it's a wonderful, wonderful example of this particular type of quilt. There are very few Moravians left in this country. Because of their beliefs and all, most have moved on to actually South Africa, Africa and South Africa. I think left in Pennsylvania that I'm familiar with. But there are still Moravians, but they don't quilt anymore.
So, Jerry, we're getting out the quilt top now.
Okay. There's always an exception to the rules, and this is one of them. That is because it's on a white background. And And normally, we wouldn't have possibly even bought this had it not been that the colors that were used in the 4-block applique are the Moravian colors. And then there was one other quilt, Moravian quilt, in the collection, which isn't in the collection anymore. It's now in the collection of the Boston Museum. But in this particular case, this in the center, and then the blocks all around, and then this beautiful, beautiful swag border.
Can I put in a plug? You can actually see this quilt, the double piece quilt, on view right now through the summer in the Folk Art Gallery of the Museum of Fine Arts.
All right, now, the next two are also not the typical. They're atypical in that the background of yellow is very, very unusual for a Moravian quilt. But again, because of the colors that exist in the other fabrics, I can still verify that it is Moravian. I have not been able to find a Moravian quilt to add to this collection for over 20 years. So either they're all gone, or the ones that are still around are still in basements or attics or somewhere else, because people still don't like them.
What about this quilt to the right? Oh, I love this one. I'm so excited about this.
This is definitely Moravian. This is a Star of Lemoyne, and it still has the greens and the browns or reds, whichever you call it, which match all those other quilts. But this was the first one I ever saw. This was the second one I ever saw of that particular color.
So Jerry, how many women would have worked on a single quilt? How would these be made in the Moravian community, do you think?
How many what?
How many women, how many people, how many hands does each quilt represent?
A quilt was usually made by one individual. And they didn't make quilts to give away well, they did make quilts to give away, but they made quilts that were more ceremonial than quilts just to give away as gifts. So a gift of a Moravian quilt to another person, meant something.
So they did everything. They would have pieced the top or appliqued the top and then quilted it themselves at home.
You don't find much applique in Moravian quilts. These are unusual.
Oh, this is a great one.
Now, for those of you who I was afraid were not going to like all this orange, I decided to bring a couple of other quilts that aren't Moravian, but are fun to look at. And this is Pennsylvania Dutch, of course. It's Mennonite. And normally we see this pattern about this big, piece, and then put in multiples. I think this is the only one I have ever seen where the tree alone is in the device, is in the quilt itself. I want you to talk about
I'm getting distracted by quilts. I can't recall. Yes. You want to talk about this first? That's so beautiful.
Okay, I brought this, again, to show you because I thought you deserved to see it, seeing as how you went through all this orange with me. And I have the notes here as to what it is. See how big that quilt is? That's because it's old. It's early. This is well before beds were uniform. as a result of that, the biggest of the quilts, especially those in New England, because of our tall beds, were made huge like this, so that they dropped down and they cut off some of the drafts at the bottom of the bed, or there was a trundle underneath the bed. This probably dates 1840.
You can tell from the back.
And
The back
yeah,
is early.
yeah, you can see again. You can pretty much go by the fact that the back has that particular fabric on it. You're going to find that particular fabric. It's expensive, first of all, and it's early, which means somebody in the colonies had enough money to order this from England, because we didn't produce fabric in this country until 1820. And so we were always kept at bay to the Europeans. But this is a legend behind the Scottish thistle. There's a feather, there's what I originally thought was a dove, and it's not a dove, it's a raven. And a feather, which of course goes back as far in the English thrones as who is it? Prince of yeah. Some of the biggest symbols in the Scottish are of course the use of the raven, the feather, and the thistle, which is on the corner of that piece alone. Yeah, there's the thistle, the feather, and the raven. I tried to talk myself into it being a dove, but it's not a dove. It just is not the right shape. And then when I started looking up what was really permanent in Scottish folklore, is the raven. But it's a wonderful, wonderful piece.
And this
And
is,
you notice that it's printed cloth.
there's printed copy in that one, and that's beautiful. I'm glad you bought it.
Okay, I have to tell you a story. Put that down for a minute. Paul and I went to an auction in a tent in Landisville, Pennsylvania. And it was one of the Landis Farms sales. And it must have been 100 degrees. We were sweltering. We sat all day long to buy that. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to buy it, and one of the reasons I brought it, is because in the 1880s, she put her name on it. She wrote her name and attached it to the quilt, which all of you need to do. It would make anybody with my job that came later a lot easier. But not only, this is Naomi Landis, not only is she proud enough to put her name on it, but I want you to actually, when it's all stretched out, I want you to actually see how exciting and how wonderful it actually is. Now this is the, trying to think of the name of the card.
Well,
This is what happens when you start being old.
no, when you buy 1,500 quilts, it's hard to remember what the names are.
Yeah, Jen just excused it by saying, when you have so many quilts, it's hard to remember their name. Jacob Sauter, I knew it would come. I've told friends who I have not been able to think of something that I would call them later, and I've been known to call them at 2 o'clock in the morning. But when Paul and I started collecting, was the Amish and the Mennonite, the religious order quilts, because they sort of are the ones that set our souls right. And as we began to learn, and there weren't any books then. The hard thing about learning in 1966.
In the 20th century.
In the 20th century. No, there aren't the books there. How many books have been written since I've been involved in quilts?
You've written
I've got
a lot.
shelved. When I first started, there was the Romance of Patchwork. I think that was it. And it wasn't terribly good to begin with. And for us to learn, we had to learn by asking questions. Now, the one thing that was favorable for us was that we were the young kids on the block, and all the old folks loved to have us ask questions. Because they not only had the answers, but they also had the time to devote to telling us a lot of the most extraordinary things I learned about quilts were basically from people who took the time to give us some of their knowledge. And, I don't see that that's being done that often anymore because I don't find that many young people who even care.
No, but there are the 9-year-olds who made the quilts.
One of the things that shows are doing now are encouraging young people. Okay. That actually got, yes, this was chosen for the first room of quilts in color for vibrations. And it got pulled because we didn't have the space for it. As we were setting up that show, every once in a while I was always there, but when a quilt was eliminated for one reason or another, I kept saying, no. I'm sure we can find room for that. Well, in dealing with the, not only Malcolm Rogers, not only the curators, not only the designer of the show, I had very little to say. I just had to say, okay. In fact, Malcolm Rogers was the one who actually titled the show because he said, quilts in color, that's exactly what it is. But we set that exhibit up so that each of the rooms had a particular kind of quilt in it, and we set that up with the Joseph Albers theories of that particular color theory that went with the quilts in that room. So it was a normal progression from one room to the next. This is a typical Pennsylvania Dutch quilt. And as we started collecting and started learning, we began to realize there are a lot of things out there that are as artistic as a lot of what we are seeing in both the Mennonite and the Amish quilts. And this is one of them. In fact, there's a quilt in this quilt shop. This is the same pattern. It is done by today's standards. They're thinner, but they're just as visually active as this one was, as this one is. But we did not collect traditional quilts either until about 20 or 30 years into collecting, when we realized that the collection needs to also represent the tradition of quilt making. And we looked very, very hard to find traditional quilts like the white.
Baskets.
Yeah.
Baskets.
But we did it in our own way. We made sure that even if the contrast of white was in the quilt, it had an important part of the quilt in terms of the design. I want Jen to tell you a little bit about what we learned in our last exhibit, which was, is it down now?
No, there's one more venue.
Where?
At the First Art Museum in Nashville, Tennessee.
Okay, it still is on its way to Nashville. Now, it didn't go in its entirety, but it did go in enough of it so that the relationship between the times that was important for us to show, which was from the beginning till right up to today. And Jen got to experience some of the trips that were taken into New York to look at some of the contemporary work that is being done by young people today. I didn't feel that it was my point to just introduce quilts and quilt makers from the quilt world. I felt it was important that this exhibit go beyond my experiences and beyond my expertise and beyond my criticism. So Jen and the other two, there were 4 of us that actually were involved in that particular show. So she's going to tell you a little bit about that.
Thanks, Jerry. Well, I think you were always there with us, and really, it was your work starting in the 1970s that was the genesis of quilts, of Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories that opened at the NFA.
How many of you got to see that exhibit? Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories.
Well, thank you for attending, and
How many of you saw Quilts in Color?
oh,
Wow, great.
yeah. Today and our efforts to bring quilts to people in an art museum context. And I think that's one thing I've really learned from you, Jerry, is to understand not only the historical context for the making of quilts, but also the visual impact that these have, and how I've always been able, I have no problem appreciating works of art from, we don't know the name of the maker. And I always feel like it's one of my jobs as a curator of textiles at the Museum of Fine Arts to remind people who come to the museum that that is in fact true, that we often don't know the names of artists.
Fun we had with Quilts in Color.
We had so much fun. So we were so fortunate. We had a wonderful designer who instantly, she was trained as an architect, but instantly understood Jerry's mission, really main focus to have people understand quilts through the idea of color interaction. And anyone who's been to art school or has taken an art class, those sort of basic ideas of cool and warm colors. Well, Joseph Albers, who was part of the Bauhaus, he and then eventually went to Yale and was actually Jerry's a guest professor, guest teacher at Worcester Art Museum School. He brought these ideas of color interaction to an American audience. And when we were doing Quilts in Color, which opened in 2014, it was actually the 50th anniversary. It was right after the 50th, it was a year after the 50th anniversary of the publication of Interaction of Color by Joseph Albers. So unbeknownst to us, we really had hit a moment in time where people were essentially going back, because you talk about your teaching art students how to quilt and quilting, and a lot of our students actually after a certain point didn't learn about color theory or color interaction. And so it was, I always call it a designer show, an artist show, because people walked in and from all walks of life, whether they thought they were interested in quilts or not, and they left just like completely converted to this art form. And I think it's because it reflected exactly the way you and Paul would look at quilts. 20 feet back, what is this saying to me as a visual art object?
Mm-hmm. I think there was something in that show for everyone. That is really where that came off, especially spanning that amount of time, which had never been done before. I think the 2 exhibits we did were both exhibits that had never been done before. And this is what has made me realize so much about the whole museum world, is the fact that you can't just put a bunch of pretty things up and have people go in and see it and say, oh, aren't they pretty? People want to know, and those of us who do know want them to know as well. So it's been an incredible experience, for me, and one that I would have never ever been able to experience except through these silly pieces of cloth where somebody sat there for hours and quilted.
They are really beautiful. And then today is actually the inaugural unveiling of your Moravian quilt collection, right?
Yep.
So you in the audience are the first to see this whole group together at the same time. And thank you.
I can't believe it. We actually made it on time.
I know, this is a record, actually.
Now, if there's any questions, I'm still suffering from an ear a problem that I had. I had what do you call it? I can't even think. Sinus infection. So my hearing isn't back to normal yet. It better hurry up, though. But, so if there's any questions, if I can't hear you, Jen can hear you. But thank you for coming.
Yes,
this
thank
is a
you
very
very
nice
much.
group of people.
Thank you.
And such an incredibly beautiful facility. This is really a treat. By the way, I am a native of Worcester, Massachusetts. So I can remember coming down to this part of the country when I was little. In fact, we were driving through the center of town. I said, I remember this. I probably was only 8 or 9 years old, but I remember it. So you're very fortunate.
I think I see someone's hand raised over there.
We have time for Q&A, and I'm just going to walk a bike
Holler if
around.
you've got a question.
We have a microphone too, even better.
Mike.
Okay, she's going to say her question.
Were these done by hand, only by hand, or were the singer treadles out at that time?
So were they made by hand, or were the Singer treadle sewing machines involved? Do people use sewing machines for the straight seams? So for the straight seams, or tell me if this is wrong, but this is what you told me. So for the straight seams, I mean, if you imagine yourself as like an Amish mother of 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 children, and you need to make quilts pretty fast, then for the straight seams, you would use a sewing machine.
Right. As soon as the sewing machine was available, even if you made your blocks by hand, the long seams, the straight seams, were all done by machine. The treadle was offered in this country before the Civil War, but it did not become extremely dispersed throughout the country until after. It's the Civil War that disrupted the distribution of the Singer sewing machine. And the Singer was the first thing to come where you could buy it on time. But yes, the sewing machine did not come into quilt making, did not do quilts by machine except for baby quilts or crib quilts, because you could manipulate them under, but you couldn't manipulate a whole quilt underneath. So the big quilts were always done by hand.
Until
Except now,
when?
of course.
When did the long arm quilter get on the scene?
Long arm quilter came on the scene, I don't know, I can't remember it not being here, but maybe I'm just, it must have come on the scene in the 70s and the
80s.
80s. So the 80s is when machine quilting really started to take off.
Now, the woman who quilts my quilts for me, she has 3 of them. And she's a really good quilter. But the one thing that I demand is that she not go over a seam. I don't want my quilts to have quilting anywhere other than within the seams themselves. So therefore, I can be guaranteed that the scale of the quilting is going to have something to do with the piecing of the quilt.
We have
And
another
they-
question up here.
and antique quilts weren't quilted over the seam because your fingers would be bloody. Remember, you've got two seam allowances on either side of a seam. So you've got the back, the batting, the top, whether it's applique, whether it's whole cloth, whether it's patchwork, to go through with your needle and thread. So the quilting usually stayed within the seams of the quilt itself.
And I think there's another question.
Another question. But before we do that, how many of you have a Singer? Raise your hand if you've got a Singer sewing machine. See?
But
It's
tell me,
alive and well.
How many people have Singer sewing?
We have a
me
question.
too. I got two,
Yeah,
in case one runs out.
got to have that.
There were 5 at one time, but I think Paul took 3 with him when he went.
And Jerry, we have a question up here.
Here's a question.
So I'm curious about, I know nothing about quilts. This is my introduction. I'm curious about where you would see it in the home and how it would be used. I got a sense that it was, but they were put on the beds, or were they not, or they were folded up. You said people didn't sleep under them. Like, where would you see them?
No, they were meant, you would see them on a bed, certainly, and they were used on beds, and often in multiple layers on beds. But the quilts that you saw today and the quilts in many museum collections are often ones that were hardly on beds, if at all. They would be folded up and put away or they'd maybe be on the bottom of that stack of quilts. But they're in such good condition and often have never even been washed. So you're seeing, essentially what you're seeing if you go to a museum or today, you're seeing the quilt the way the artist would have seen, the community would have seen the quilt as soon as it was taken off of a quilt frame after it was done being quilted. Do you agree with that?
People who no longer quilted, who inherited quilts, didn't have enough sense to take care of them. There's a way of using a quilt without destroying it. And unfortunately, we have lost so many quilts because of the way people didn't appreciate them. And many of the quilts in our collection, my collection, have never been washed, have never been used, and never even seen the light of day. Because when they were probably made by not only someone who really was proud of their own work, but then they were inherited by people who were really proud of the work that was done by former generations. You can use something without destroying it. And as far as I'm concerned, quilts are the kind of thing that once you learn how to read them, they're going to tell you an awful lot. And they're probably going to tell you things that nothing else can.
Question here.
I'm wondering what you would want to say, or what you would want us to say, to the snobby art critics who want to put quilts down, put quilts down and maybe make the distinction between art and craft.
So this is the question about art critics who make a distinction between art and craft and don't consider quilts art. What would you say to that imaginary critic who's sitting right here in the center of the room?
Remember when all of us were sitting across the street at the Boston Museum waiting for, what was his name? The art critic, the one we were all
Afraid of. Yeah.
What was his name?
I can't.
Simon.
I'm not going to say his name. But,
Okay. He's not in Boston anymore.
No.
Well, it couldn't have been a better review than it said, "Don't walk, run," to the Boston Museum to see the quilt show. And we were all so afraid. I would read anything that man writes because I've read a lot of his reviews. As far as this whole thing between what is art and what is craft, we've gotten to the point where we don't use the word craft because it's like a dirty word. It's like those things that you make to put over the toilet paper on the back of the john, you know? That's sort of my idea of what a craft is. But I know an awful lot of really good craftsmen who don't necessarily make art that some people would say. So take what you want and leave the rest was a good example that I have. But don't be a snob. Don't be an art snob.
Well, there's a lesson for tonight. Any more questions? I've got one here. Just hold it.
I've thoroughly enjoyed this. And the show is fantastic. And we are, most of us, I think, quilters to some degree.
Can't hear it.
Can you hear me all right?
That's
Is that better?
thanks.
Okay, thank you. Since most of us are quilters and have various art quilts and special quilts and wall quilts at home, how do you suggest that we store them to keep them in good shape?
Special quilts, how do you store them?
Storing, that's a good question. I've always had big houses. And the reason I've always had big houses is that the quilts take up 10 times as much room as I do. But generally, I like to store things flat. And right now, I've built a new house. And again, it has more storage for them than me. But first of all, the atmosphere is controlled in the space, and specifically with regard to moisture. There's a what do you call them, that run 24 hours a day?
Dehumidifier.
Dehumidifier, yeah. And the heating isn't as much of a problem. In California, for instance, for all the years I was there, we had to not only cool, but we also had to cool and dehumidify. Well, the humidity is the biggest problem. Flat is not necessarily good for everybody. If you can't do flat, then do folded, but do folded in a acid-free box with tissue paper or something to cushion the folds so that it doesn't become a seam. Extra beds, now that all your kids are gone, are a great place for quilts. And every once in a while, if there is something I want to get out of the collection to see, I will put it on the guest room bed because I know nobody's going in there anymore and I can go in and see it every time I want. And I'll often fold things up and put them on the foot of beds. But I don't use them for cover. And I have a dog, so but he knows the ones he can get on and he knows the ones he can't get on.
It'd be great if we all had pets like that. Any other questions before we have
over on the left.
one more round? Over here. I'm going to have you pass it in. This line can do it. Pass it.
Did we forget anything?
No. They've asked such good.
Hi there. I just want to start by thanking you so much for sharing the wealth of material culture that you have with us in the room. I think it was so extraordinary and really wonderful. So thank you. And then,
You know, we hate to do this.
yes, torture for all of us.
Something you just have to do.
Exactly. So I just have a comment and then a question. And I think the comment is, I love to sew. I love to quilt. I grew up in a family where that was a really strong tradition. I learned how to sew from my grandmother and from my mother. And I think one of the best ways to get young people to sew today is to expose them to beautiful quilts. So I hope we live in a world in the future where the things that we saw today can be accessible to as many people, many young people as possible in the future. So I hope we live in a world where that is possible, where more people can see these beautiful and wonderful works of art. So that's a comment. And then the question is, we're here also commemorating the 250th, and I look at these quilts and I just imagine all of the work that went into the production of these, and I wonder if both of you could perhaps comment on the history of American women's work over the last 250 years by way of these things that we looked at today. Thank you very much.
I'm gonna leave you with a story.
It's a good story.
Sandy Fox, who was head of the Los Angeles County Museum quilt department for a while, went to work for the University of Nebraska, and her job was to go into all of the small historical societies, whatever, in the state of Nebraska, and record any of the documentation she could find relating to quilt making. Here's a story that she found in one of the diaries of a woman from the 1860s who lived in a
Sod house.
soddy. You know what a soddy is? Okay, it's a sod house out on the prairie where the walls are sod and the roof is covered with sod in order to be built. She says, "I make my quilts as fast as I can so my children won't freeze, and as beautiful as I can so my heart won't break." I think that's sort of what quilting has been for people throughout the ages. Do you know how far back quilting goes? It goes back past recorded time. It's that old. Every culture had it. And think of this. What's the next important thing for us as human beings to survive other than food? Warmth. Warmth. Quilts. In order to survive, the human being can't live in just the cold itself. So anyway, thank you for coming.
Thank you. How are you doing? You're doing very well for not being able to hear anything. That's very good.
Thank you for coming. We just want to express our gratitude one more time with a gift of appreciation for Jen and for Jerry. This is on behalf of Concord 250 and Quilts 250. This is an unusual time in our history, and we're glad you could all be a part of it. One more round of applause.